Tyler Grange didn't mutter the word died. He hurled it across the Camp Lejeune mess hall like an insult meant to stick. Petty Officer First Class Mara Kelton had just reached for her water when his shove hit her shoulder hard enough to throw her into the table's edge, her tray crashing to the floor, and food scattering across the government-issue linoleum. She was 29, lean and sunbaked, her calloused hands shaped by work most people would never picture. To Grange, she looked like a misplaced sailor, isolated, unlikely to fight back. What he didn't catch was the small crescent scar on her left forearm, surgical Steele's memory from a breaching charge mishap in Helmand. He also didn't notice how her pupils tightened and widened as she mapped every exit, potential threat, and makeshift weapon within reach. He had no clue the quiet woman eating alone had spent 6 years embedded with joint intelligence teams, teaching SEAL operators how to pull high-value targets out of places normal units feared to tread. He thought he was embarrassing a desk-bound sailor. He didn't realize he'd just provoked someone who'd endured 72 hours in a kill zone that should have ended her. The hall went still, conversations dying mid-sentence. The real question wasn't if she'd react. It was what would happen once people learned who she actually was. Outside, the August heat smothered Camp Lejeune like a soaked blanket, the Carolina humidity clinging to every breath. The enlisted mess hall sat low beside the barracks, a cinder block box that smelled of bleach and reheated chow. Inside, buzzing fluorescent lights washed over rows of plastic chairs and laminate tables worn down by years of Marines passing through. Silverware clinked, voices overlapped, boots scraped across tiles polished smooth by decades of footsteps. Mara Kelton, sitting alone in the back corner with her shoulders angled to the wall, ate with the steady precision of someone who wasted neither food nor seconds. Her short, practical dark hair carried early gray at the temples, and her Type 3 Navy uniform contrasted the sea of Marine camis around her. A battered black dive watch sat on her left wrist, its face nearly opaque from years of hard use. Her hands revealed more than she ever said. Knuckle scars, thick calluses from tools, rope, and weapons, and that familiar crescent scar she sometimes brushed without realizing, a leftover reflex from Helmand 3 years earlier. She'd been stationed at Lejeune for 2 months under administrative orders no one seemed able to explain. Navy personnel on a Marine base weren't unusual. Corpsmen, intel specialists, support staff. But Mara didn't fit neatly into any category. She checked in with a Marine major from the G2 shop, handled vague training coordination tasks, and moved through the base with a quiet presence that drew attention precisely because she wasn't seeking any. If you're tuning in from North Carolina or any other military town, you've seen people like her before. The quiet ones who move with a different kind of weight, taking up space without ever demanding attention. And if this story feels familiar, hit subscribe. Major Tom's Tales exists to tell the stories the system prefers to keep in the dark. Lance Corporal Tyler Grange had been watching Mara Kelton for weeks. At 24, he looked like someone who invested far more effort into his physique than his professionalism, sporting a regulation high and tight and a habit of talking bigger than his experience allowed. 2 deployments, Okinawa training cycles and convoy security in Djibouti, had inflated an ego far beyond what his resume deserved. What actually got under his skin wasn't that she was Navy. It was that she passed him without so much as a nod, as if he didn't factor into her world at all. Sometimes the crescent scar on her forearm caught the light when she moved, but she never offered explanations. The few who asked got polite evasions, and eventually people stopped trying. Mara Kelton grew up in Red Ridge, Nevada, in a weathered double-wide that always smelled like gun oil and her father's old Camel cigarettes. Robert Kelton, who had served in Force Recon back in the 1980s before Raider made its return, carried the invisible heaviness of Lebanon and Grenada long after he came home. He drove long-haul routes and spent weekends teaching his daughter lessons most parents never considered: reading the night sky for navigation, fixing weapons blindfolded, staying calm when everything went sideways. He didn't tell war stories, he taught survival rules. Never assume backup will show. Never trust gear you haven't checked yourself. Never expect someone to save you simply because they should. By 16, Mara could strip an M4 without looking and run 12 miles with a loaded pack without complaint. Her mother had walked out when she was 9, unable to live with Robert's silences or the ghosts he never spoke about. From then on, it was just father and daughter, and he raised her the only way he understood. She enlisted at 18, not for guidance, but because her father once told her that the only way to know what you're made of is to be tested by people who don't care whether you make it. She chose the Navy, signed on as a cryptologic technician for the Clearances and Challenge, and spent her first 3 years working signals intelligence aboard destroyers and at shore commands. That was when someone from JSOC's intelligence support activity quietly approached her. No last names, no long explanations. Just a visit after a training scenario where she'd caught a comms pattern missed by 3 senior analysts. They asked if she wanted work that mattered. Work that would never appear in official files, but would push every boundary she thought she had. She agreed. The next 6 years stripped away any illusions about intel work. She wasn't sitting behind screens anymore. She was on the ground with SEAL teams and Army Special Mission Units, supplying real-time intelligence in places where one mistake meant disappearing forever. She learned to breach because extra hands were needed, learned casualty care because medics weren't always close, learned to move, shoot, and communicate like her life depended on it, because it did. Helmand Province, 2021, a 4-man SEAL element, and Mara were inserted to extract a high-value target holding intel on an imminent attack against U.S. forces in Kabul. The operation collapsed when militia forces encircled the compound and severed all extraction routes. For 72 hours they held that building, low on ammo, low on water, patching wounds with whatever they could improvise. Mara caught shrapnel when a breaching charge blew too close. The crescent scar on her forearm was the only visible souvenir. All 5 survived. The HVT survived. The attack on Kabul never happened. Lieutenant Aaron Huxley, the SEAL team lead, didn't make it 8 months later, killed by an IED near Ramadi. Mara received the news through unofficial channels because her work was too classified for regular casualty notifications. She carried Huxley's memory like quiet weight, not guilt, but the heaviness that settles on those who walk away when others don't. After his death, she requested out of JSOC, told her handler she was done operating in places that officially didn't exist. They crafted an administrative cover story and shipped her to Camp Lejeune with a sanitized record that concealed 6 years of work no one on base could begin to imagine. The promise Mara Kelton made to herself was straightforward. Keep her profile low, bury herself in forgettable administrative duties, and try to live like something other than a sharpened instrument until her 20 years were up and she could vanish for good. That plan cracked the moment Tyler Grange decided she needed a reminder that, in his mind, women had no place in his Marine Corps. Grange hadn't been born cruel. He'd been shaped that way by a father who equated worth with dominance, and by an older brother who'd passed Marine Raider selection and never let Tyler forget it. He grew up under that shadow, throwing punches long before he understood math, and carried that bruised hunger through Paris Island and into the Fleet Marine Force, desperate to prove himself to people who weren't even looking anymore. His deployments, quiet tours in Okinawa and Djibouti, never delivered the combat trial he fantasized about, leaving him hollow and scrambling for validation. So he built his identity around iron plates, loud bravado, and a small circle of junior Marines who mistook his aggression for authority. When Petty Officer First Class Mara Kelton arrived 2 months earlier, silent, composed, and completely unfazed by him, something inside him buckled. It began with muttered comments in the passageways, just loud enough for her to catch. Squid on a Marine base. Probably never left the comfort of a ship. Bet she thinks she's special. Grange kept Daniels and Cooper at his side, his personal chorus, who laughed on cue and helped shoulder-check her in hallways or block her path at the exchange. Their harassment was practiced. Small, sharp jabs designed to assert dominance without tipping into anything that would spark an official report. Mara never reacted. She simply looked at him the way someone calculates angles and distances, then walked past as if he were background noise. No fear, no irritation, just a cool assessment that made him feel weighed and found lacking. That quiet dismissal ate at him. So he staged the mess hall incident on purpose, choosing a crowded moment so he'd have an audience. When he shoved her and sent her tray crashing to the floor, when he spat that insult across the room, he waited for tears or anger, anything he could twist into another humiliation. Instead, Mara rose calmly, brushed the rice from her uniform, and held his eyes for a slow, steady 3-count that stretched into an eternity. Then she simply walked away, a controlled exit that made it clear she was choosing not to unleash something she kept tightly caged. The mess hall froze for a heartbeat. Then the muted sounds returned. Staff Sergeant Trevor Miles, sitting a few tables away, didn't laugh. He'd worked with JSOC teams before, and he recognized the subtle cues, the way Mara had scanned the room, the precision in her movements, the economy of energy. He didn't know who she was, but he knew enough to worry. The next morning, Grange and his entourage were in the base gym when Mara came in for her usual PT. She didn't look at them, didn't break stride, just walked to the pull-up bar and began her routine. 20 dead-hang pull-ups, smooth, controlled, with barely a shift in her breathing. Grange watched from the bench press, heat rising under his skin. Part anger, part embarrassment, part something he couldn't name. He marched up to her while she paused for water. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he told her Navy support staff should stay in their lane, that she was taking space real Marines needed, that maybe she should head back to a safe ship if she couldn't handle Marine Corps culture. Mara drank her water and looked at him like he was a training problem she'd mastered years ago, then returned to her pull-ups as if he hadn't spoken. Something snapped inside Grange then, a mix of frustration, humiliation, and confusion that his intimidation didn't land. And that's when he started planning something bigger, something he hoped would finally force her to react. He never got the opportunity to escalate. That same afternoon, Captain Joel Harridan, the company commander, announced a mandatory formation for the following morning. Harridan was a prior enlisted Mustang with a Force Recon past, the kind of leader whose presence straightened backs without a single raised word. He didn't offer explanations, just noted that attendance wasn't optional. That night, Mara Kelton sat on her rack in the dim barracks, still dressed in her PT gear. The room carried the smell of industrial cleaner mixed with decades of sweat absorbed into the walls. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of holding steady when every instinct she'd sharpened over 6 years told her to retaliate. She could have ended Tyler Grange in the mess hall with ease. Dozens of close-quarters techniques lived permanently in her muscles. She could have shown him how catastrophically he'd misjudged her. But that wasn't the deal she'd made with herself when she left the JSOC world behind. No more violence, no more shadow missions. Just quiet administrative work until her service commitment ran out, and she could slip into a civilian life where she didn't have to evaluate threats every time she entered a room. She removed her battered dive watch and set it gently on the wall locker. The watch face was so scratched it barely reflected light anymore. She'd worn it in Helmand while helping a SEAL platoon plan breaches on fortified compounds. She'd worn it in Yemen during a 72-hour siege she shouldn't have survived. She'd worn it in Ramadi the day word reached her that Lieutenant Aaron Huxley was gone. Huxley used to say the hardest part of their job wasn't the danger. It was learning how to come home afterward and act like you were normal, pretend you hadn't seen or done things that would haunt anyone else. He told her the only real safeguard was choosing a moral line and refusing to cross it no matter the pressure. Leaving JSOC had been that line for her. She'd hoped that blending into routine Navy duties would bury Helmand and Yemen far enough down that they'd stop clawing their way back up. But Grange had ripped all that to the surface. Not because he physically hurt her, she'd endured far worse from actual enemies, but because he made her visible again, a target. And she knew that if she responded with even a fraction of her real capability, people would ask questions. Her real file might get pulled, and the carefully built cover story would fall apart. She lay back on the rack, staring at the water-stained tiles overhead. Tomorrow's formation meant Harridan had a plan. She'd seen it in the way he read the room earlier. Something was coming. Something that would force choices she'd been avoiding. For Huxley, she thought. For the promise she made in that Helmand compound, that if she lived, she'd try to be something other than a weapon. She closed her eyes and waited for morning. At 0600 the next day, the company formed up under a cool, overcast sky. 140 Marines stood in ranked rows on the parade deck while Captain Harridan paced before them, hands clasped behind his back. 38 years old, with the calm authority of someone forged in real combat instead of simulations, he spoke without theatrics. Certain behaviors, he said, had come to his attention. Behaviors that violated the most basic standards of respect and discipline. They would be addressed immediately. He then announced the start of a leadership evaluation exercise, a compressed 3-day field assessment covering everything from land navigation to tactical decision-making under stress. The results would be entered into permanent records and shape future promotions and assignments. Harridan's eyes fixed on Tyler Grange, and he stated plainly that, given how vocal Grange had been about standards and warrior ethos, he expected him to volunteer first. Grange flushed but stepped forward. There was no backing down in front of the entire company. Harridan called for 9 more volunteers. 7 Marines stepped up instantly. Junior NCOs and senior lance corporals eager to prove themselves. Then Harridan turned his attention to Mara Kelton, standing quietly in the back rank in her Navy uniform. He said he was specifically requesting Petty Officer First Class Kelton to participate not only as a competitor, but also as an evaluator, citing instructor-level qualifications in small unit tactics noted in her file from earlier joint training assignments. The formation fell into absolute silence, and Tyler Grange looked as if someone had struck him. Mara Kelton kept her expression steady and stepped forward without the slightest pause. The assessment kicked off at 0800. The first event was a 12-mile tactical movement under full combat load, cutting through swamp, pine forest, and open ground with simulated casualties that had to be treated and carried correctly. Grange surged ahead, pushing an aggressive pace meant to assert dominance. Mara stayed mid-pack, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who'd hauled weight through terrain where slowing down meant dying. By mile 8, 3 Marines had already fallen out. Grange kept pushing, but his shoulders sagged, his stride shortened, and his breath rasped. Mara hadn't changed pace once. The second event was a tactical problem-solving drill, a building clearance scenario with minimal intel. Grange immediately tried to take charge, barking orders that sounded like movie dialogue instead of Marine doctrine, turning the exercise into a Hollywood fantasy. Mara watched silently for 2 minutes, then asked the evaluators if she could offer a recommendation. They told her to go ahead. Using a stick, she drew a full plan in the dirt, proper room-clearing sequences, overlapping fields of fire, phased entry movements, security retention. She explained fatal funnels, angles, and exposure points the way someone does when they've planned real missions where mistakes lead to flag-draped coffins. Grange tried to protest, but Staff Sergeant Trevor Miles, the senior evaluator, shut him down and ordered them to execute Mara's plan. It ran flawlessly. Not a single simulated casualty. Day 2 brought the evolution designed to break people. Combat casualty care under stress, multiple wounded, scarce supplies, and simulated fire exploding around them with blanks and pyrotechnics. Most participants froze or made brutal mistakes, wrong tourniquet placement, failed airway checks, poor triage. Mara moved with the practiced composure of someone who'd done this with real blood on the ground, sorting casualties by severity, tightening tourniquets with perfect tension, issuing directions for covering fire while working. When Grange panicked and slapped a vented chest seal on without checking for tension pneumothorax, she calmly corrected him, guiding his hands to place it as the casualty exhaled, explaining the signs to watch for, and demonstrating how to burp the seal if pressure built. Routine TCCC steps she'd performed under actual fire in Helmand. Gunnery Sergeant Blake Aereo, watching beside Miles, narrowed his eyes more with each passing minute. During a water break, he pulled Captain Harridan aside and murmured something that made Harridan nod slowly. The final evolution was a 24-hour patrol-based defense. No sleep. Constant planning. Rotating leadership. Maintaining security. By hour 18, Grange was making mistakes that would have wiped out an entire squad. By hour 22, his decisions bordered on fatal. Mara remained sharp, rotating personnel with precision, catching errors before they spiraled. At dawn on day 3, only 4 of the original 10 were still functional. Grange was barely among them. Mara looked like she could have kept going another full day. Harridan assembled everyone on the parade deck for the debrief. Behind him stood a Navy commander no one recognized, dressed in service whites with a chest full of ribbons that hinted at operations never mentioned in official channels. Commander Helen O'Rourke, 52, with iron-gray hair pinned in a tight bun and an intensity that made Mara's spine stiffen automatically, carried Naval Special Warfare insignia and ribbons that included bronze stars with V devices, a silver star, and several classified citations disguised as generic awards to those who didn't know better. Rourke didn't open with pleasantries. She instructed Captain Harridan to dismiss the rest of the company, keeping only the assessment participants and NCO evaluators. Once the deck cleared, she walked straight to Mara and told her to turn her head left. Mara did, exposing the faint crescent scar on her forearm. Rourke gave a single confirming nod, then turned to address the exhausted Marines. She said she was about to reveal details of an operation that had been classified until recently, but was now cleared for training discussion. She asked if any of them recognized the name Operation Crosswind. Every face remained blank. Tyler Grange looked dazed, angry, exhausted, and barely upright after 3 days without sleep. Commander Helena Rourke began explaining that Operation Crosswind had been a joint JSOC mission carried out in Helmand Province in 2021. A 4-man SEAL element and 1 Navy intelligence specialist were inserted to extract a high-value target, carrying intel about an imminent large-scale attack on U.S. forces in Kabul. The operation unraveled when local militia forces surrounded the compound and severed all extraction routes. For 72 hours, the team held defensive positions against overwhelming numbers, running low on ammunition and fighting without air support. All 5 operators survived, the HVT survived, and the intelligence they pulled out prevented an attack that would have killed more than 200 Americans. She paused long enough for the weight of that to land. Then she revealed that the intelligence specialist in that operation had been cryptologic technician First Class Mara Kelton, who'd spent 6 years attached to JSOC intel detachments supporting naval special warfare in denied areas across 3 continents. The parade deck fell silent, except for wind moving through the pine trees. Rourke continued, detailing how Mara had provided direct action support, delivered tactical intelligence while under fire, trained SEAL elements in comm security and counter-surveillance, and assisted in missions that saved hundreds of American lives. The scar on her forearm, she said, came from a breaching charge during the Helmand fight. Classified commendations were awarded to her, too, citations that couldn't appear in any official record. Rourke added that Mara had requested reassignment to conventional duty after her SEAL team leader was killed in Ramadi, and that her transfer was processed discreetly to protect operational security. Grange's face had gone ghost white. The Marines around Mara stared like they were seeing her for the first time. Rourke turned to Mara and asked, plainly, without accusation, why she had walked away from JSOC to take an administrative liaison job on a Marine base. It was the first time Mara had spoken in 3 days. She said she'd lost her team leader. Said she'd made a promise to try living a different kind of life. Said she was done working in places that officially didn't exist. Rourke nodded with the quiet understanding of someone who'd carried her own ghosts. Then she explained that, based on Mara's performance during the assessment, Captain Harridan had submitted a request to permanently assign her as a combat instructor with the Marine Corps Martial Arts program at Quantico, a full instructor billet, teaching Marines and sailors small unit movement, close quarters combat, and survival techniques in urban environments. No more admin work, no more hiding. Rourke asked if she would accept the assignment. Mara glanced at the Marines around her, at Grange, who couldn't meet her eyes, at Staff Sergeant Trevor Miles, who gave the smallest nod, at the evaluators who'd watched her operate for 3 days and recognized exactly what she was. She thought of Lieutenant Aaron Huxley, of the promise she made in that Helmand compound, and wondered whether teaching others to stay alive counted as redemption. She said yes. Rourke shook her hand, said the orders would be processed within the week, then dismissed the group without ceremony, leaving Mara standing alone on the parade deck as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds. Grange filed a transfer request before the day was over. Within 48 hours, Captain Harridan approved it and added a counseling statement documenting the incident and Grange's performance. The paperwork would follow him, and word spread through the battalion faster than any official memo ever could. The quiet Navy petty officer Tyler Grange had assaulted in the mess hall turned out to be a confirmed JSOC operator with a classified service record that made ordinary deployments look like basic rehearsals. Mara Kelton spent her final 2 weeks at Camp Lejeune out processing and preparing for her transfer, and Marines who once ignored her now greeted her in hallways with silent nods of respect. Staff Sergeant Trevor Miles bought her a coffee at the post exchange and asked a few careful questions about Helmand, questions she answered just vaguely enough to stay within the limits of her NDA while still telling him what he needed to know. Even the base sergeant major stopped her outside the gym to thank her for her service. On her last morning at Lejeune, she found an envelope slipped under her barracks door. Inside was a handwritten note from Grange, 3 brief sentences. He apologized. He said his insecurity had turned him into someone he didn't recognize, and he wrote that he was submitting a package for Marine Raider assessment and selection because he wanted to earn the right to call himself a warrior instead of pretending to be one. Mara read it twice and tucked it into her personal effects. She didn't need the apology, but she respected the courage it took to write it. The drive to Quantico took 6 hours along Carolina back roads and the long stretch of Virginia highways. She reported to the Marine Corps martial arts program on a Monday morning that smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and possibility. Master Gunnery Sergeant Damon Crowell, the senior instructor, a man with 3 Fallujah tours and more close-quarters combat certifications than there was wall space for, shook her hand. He said he'd reviewed her real service record, not the sanitized version, the classified one that required special access to even open. JSOC intelligence operators rarely rotated into instructor roles, he told her, and he looked forward to learning from her as much as teaching. Her first class consisted of 23 lance corporals, fresh out of the School of Infantry, young, energetic, and carrying that particular brand of confidence only new Marines have. She stood before them in a plain instructor uniform, petty officer rank on her chest, her scarred Dave watch on her wrist, and nothing else hinting at the life she'd lived. She introduced herself, mentioned Helmand, Yemen, and a few other places they might have heard about, and told them she was going to teach them how to survive situations most people didn't walk away from. The training would be hard, she said, but fair, and anyone who passed her course would leave with skills that could save their lives and the lives of the Marines beside them. Then she told them to pair up and get ready, because talk was cheap and the only thing that mattered was what you could do when everything went sideways. As they trained, she thought of Lieutenant Aaron Huxley, of Yemen and Helmand, and of that promise she'd whispered to herself while waiting for dawn in the ruined compound. Maybe this was how you kept a promise like that. Not by disappearing, but by passing everything you'd learned to the ones who came next.